As part of my design team duties over at the Counterfeit Kit Challenge, we make our own supplies once a month. They call it Forgery on the 4th over there. I call it my monthly makes. I actually have a total of 3 tutorials for you today. This one, we're going to be making these stuffed stars and learning how to blanket stitch. Hello everybody, welcome to Crafty Soup. My name is Misty, where I create with paper and photos in artful ways. Let's make some stuffed felt stars. I am going to die cut these stars with, I have nested star dies from Pink Fresh Studio, and I'm going to cut them out of felt. You can cut them out of regular fabric, but many fabrics will fray. So if you do use a regular fabric, you can add dabs of glue to the edges of the fabric to prevent them from fraying and falling apart. And then you can use whatever fabric you want. Now, felt normally does die cut. This happens to be an extra thick felt. If you're having trouble die cutting your felt, put a layer of cardstock or even 2 layers of cardstock underneath your felt where the die cuts into all of that. That helps the felt, or rather that helps the die have more space to push down and gets you a cleaner cut. Now, even with a couple of shims, you may still have, with these extra thick felt, some places where it is holding on by threads of fabric. Go ahead and just snip them apart with scissors and you should be good. Now, the normal felt that I use is just regular craft felt from the craft store, and I had no problems die cutting that. You can see it off over there. I'm going to use DMC floss to sew these together, and this is DMC 926 in case you like this color. I'm going to be sewing using a blanket stitch, which I don't usually do. And if you've never done it, don't know what it is, I will show you in detail how to do this. The first thing to do is to cut off a length of your floss and then pull out the threads. If you hold it from the top, grab one thread and then just pull it straight up. The bottom threads will kind of curl up in your hand, but for some reason, they don't tangle. So once you have those 3 threads pulled apart, line them all back up on the end, and then I'm a licker. I will lick my threads to help me with the needle threading process. You can use a sponge and dampen your fingers and do that. You could also use this needle threading tool, which has a much wider space on a thin metal eye, I guess you can call it, that you can put your needle over that space and then thread your threads through the larger eye. And then once you get all of that, oh, I took it off camera to lick it, pardon me. But once you get it through there, then you can pull your needle over the thread and through the eye, and then that helps you thread your needles. This is not a typical sewing needle. This is an embroidery needle, so you want to have some of those on hand. So let's go back here for a second. When I pull my thread through the needle, I'm going to leave a tail. You can kind of see it dangling down there. And you want your tail to be about half the length of your total thread. Now we're going to talk about tail tips at the end of the video. If you're not used to tying knots, what I like to do is put it over my finger, wrap it across itself, and then take that kind of tail with my thumb and roll it. And then once I roll it, that'll let me pinch it with my fingernail so that I can grab it with my other fingernail and pull down so that you have a knot. Hopefully all that made sense, but you do have the rewind and slow features on YouTube if you need to see that again. Before we get into the details of how to do this stitch, this is what we're aiming for, and you can see it's a decorative stitch that has a row of thread that follows the edge of the fabric, so it creates a nice finished look. If you don't want to hand stitch, you can certainly do these on a sewing machine, or you could just hot glue them together. Just leave an opening so that you can stuff it before you finish gluing. All right, let's get started with our stitching tutorial. So to get started, I like to stitch up from the inside of my fabric, and that will help hide that knot that we've made. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit here so that you can see the details of this tutorial better. I'm going to keep this in real time. So I bring my thread up through the inside of that fabric. That knot is now inside. I kind of tuck it down so it doesn't stick out the edge. And then I'm going to just loop my thread right around and come back up through all the layers of fabric from the back side up through that same stitch that I took to anchor my knot in there. So I pull my needle up, and here's a little bit of a tip. If you find that your thread on the back side is starting to curl and tangle, you can stick your finger in there and that'll prevent it from tangling up on you. All right, so I've left a loop as I pulled that through, and then I'm going to stick my needle back through that loop And again, I'm using my finger to help things not tangle up. And then I'm going to pull that snug, not tight, but snug, straight out from that stitch. And that's going to kind of anchor that thread now at the edge of my fabric. And then I'm going to take the next stitch along an imaginary line that is kind of even with the edge. If you can't imagine that line, you can go ahead and draw it on with like a chalk, and that'll help. You can just rub away and erase that chalk later, and that'll help you keep your stitches even and straight. I don't worry about it too much. I'm not the most even stitcher in the world, so I just do my best. All right, I'm doing it again. Let's take it a couple more times before we move on to the next step. So I've got my thread anchored at the edge. I'm going to come over a little bit, take a stitch, and then before I pull that stitch tight, I'm going to put my thread through that loop. And that helps that thread pull across the edge of the fabric as I anchor it into the next loop, which is what we're going to do here. So take a stitch through your loop, pull it straight out to keep it snug, and you may need to kind of pull your previous loop a little bit to snug it up as you move forward, depending on how the quality of your fabric and the quality of your thread and so forth. You may need to just keep snugging it up on the previous loop before you move on to the next one. All right, so here I'm snugging it up a little bit more, and I'm going to keep going. Corners need a little bit of a different process, and an inside corner is different than an outside pointy corner. So let's talk about this inside corner first. I'm going to finish off my previous stitch by making my new stitch right at the angle of that point. So I'm going to pull that tight. Now this second time, I'm not going to move over for a new stitch. I'm going to go back in that same stitch. This is exactly like we did when we started stitching to begin with. So next I'm going to bring my needle out through that same stitch, and I'm going to go ahead and loop my thread through and pull it tight right where it is. This anchors the thread in the corner, and if you don't do that anchor stitch, it can tend to cause a gap between the thread and the edge of the fabric when you take the next stitch, which I'm doing right now. And this double stitching in that inside corner helps anchor that thread so that it lays flat along the edge of your fabric. Okay, let's talk about outside corners, and this is where my skills are not the best. Just know that there may be way better ways to do this, but I'm going to show you how I do it, and if this doesn't work for you, you may be able to find something better. All right, I have just taken my last stitch before I've gotten to the corner, so notice where it is, it's nearly in the corner. So what we're going to do is go back into that same stitch, and we're going to work it the same way we do by taking our stitch and pulling our needle through the loop, but we're going to pull that thread towards the tip of the corner. Now this isn't anchored to anything at that tip, so we need to be careful when we pull it taut. We don't want to pull it so tight that it's going to scrunch up the fabric or slip off the edge. And as we take our next stitch again through that same space, we're going to want to pinch it with our fingernails to hold it so that it doesn't slip off the edge of our fabric, and then we're left with the blanket stitch that has gone awry and not following the edge of our fabric anymore. All right, once we get around that corner, we can continue on with our stitching, but let's do it again a little slower one more time. We've finished our last stitch. Our next stitch comes up through that same hole. We will pull our loop, thread through the loop, pull it snug towards the tip of the star. Careful not to pull too tight. Here I'm adjusting it. Next third stitch back through the same hole. Pull our thread, needle and thread through the loop. Pull it snug, not too snug. Hold your threads in place so it doesn't slip off the edge. Snug up that stitch, and then go ahead and take your next stitch. You might still want to keep your finger on that previous stitch so that it doesn't slip as you take the future stitches. Notice I'm just kind of adjusting it so that everything seems to be even before I move on. And then I will hold that stitch all in place and then take that next stitch. I will have a couple more sewing tips for you at the end, but let's go ahead and get to the next part of this project. When you get to almost back to the beginning, you want to leave a hole so that you can stuff it with fiberfill. I just saved fiberfill out of an old pillow, and I just grabbed a handful, stuffed it in a Ziploc bag, and threw the rest away because there was more fiberfill than I can use in a lot of projects. So that's what I've got here. I do kind of pull it off to fluff it up a little bit more because it was pretty compacted down from being in a pillow. And then I will just shove it in that hole. I leave the hole big enough so that one of my little fingers can fit in there. I just use my index finger here. And then a pencil will help you shove that fiberfill into corners, depending on your shape. If you're doing round shapes, this whole process is way easier, but with stars, you're going to have a lot of corners. Notice the fluffiness that adds. We don't want to overfill it because that can cause the fluff to start peeking through our stitches. But we want to add enough fluff to give it a little bit of texture. And I do each point of the star as well as a little bit of fluff in the center. Now this star is on the bigger size. What is it there? 1, 2, 3, 4-ish inches big, according to my grid mat there. When you're doing littler stars, you don't have to do quite as much filling, of course, and just putting a little stuffing into each corner is enough. All right, you saw my hole there was still open, and then I'm just going to finish off my stitching to close up that hole. When I get to the end, I will loop my thread back through that same loop, pull it tight, and then I will loop it through that thread one more time, pull it tight. And then here is how I kind of hide that bit of a knot. I will go ahead and stick my needle into that space through the fluff of the little star and pull it up through the middle. Now, if you tug that thread just a little bit snug, it will squish the star down a little bit. And then when you clip it and let go of the star, the loft of the star will suck that thread back in and hide the end of that thread. All right, let's talk about a couple of other stitching things that will happen to you. You will run out of thread at some point. What I like to do is open up my edge, send my needle around the stitch that you can see inside. Go ahead and send it around one more time. And this time you want to send your needle back through the loop that is formed there. And that will create a knot and hold everything in place. So I'm going to pull that pretty tight, but still making sure that it's not pulling the rest of my stitches overly tight. All right, when you start stitching again, this will be a little bit different. What you want to do is send your needle through the back of your fabric, kind of where your last stitch was. When you pull it through, kind of tuck that knot in place so it's hidden. Send your needle through the previous flat stitch along the edge of the fabric so that when you pull it snug, that new thread is going to want to line up again along the edge of the fabric. And then we can keep going with our regular stitches. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned having your tail. If your tail gets too close to where you're stitching, it's going to cause tangling. So you want to be sure as you're working to keep pulling your needle so that it keeps shortening your tail, and you don't want that tail to be much longer than the halfway point. Okay, that wraps up our stars. I hope you appreciated this kind of in-depth stitching tutorial on the blanket stitch. And here are my finished stars, and I think they're very sweet. They could even make sweet little gifts for younger kids, the kids who are beyond putting things in their mouths. So say the age of 4 and 5 would be perfect. Do remember that this video is just one of 3 tutorials I dropped today. If you're interested in those, go ahead and check them out. Plus, there's also a composite video that has everything in one video, so you have viewing options. And until next time, I hope you have an artful day.